Good morning, everyone. I know that this isn't the ideal situation. I was hoping to kind of obviously finish this in person, but because of the storm, needless to say, this is the best that we can do at the moment. So, what I'm just going to do very briefly is just cover the last couple of slides of chapter one. We'll start and hopefully finish chapter two when we see each other next week. Again, a reminder right now that your first exam is scheduled for next Friday. Again, it will be all online, so I'll give you the details a little more in depth next week. In the meantime, I should probably also remind you that your first short essay is due this coming Saturday, along with the assignments for chapter two, I believe. So please make sure that if you haven't already, make sure you start working on that before the deadlines. If you have any further questions or need clarification on the deadlines, please consult the calendar on the syllabus. All right, but other than that, let's begin. So I wanted to continue on with the lecture and focus specifically on Colonial New Mexico, which, if you recall from my the first time that we met, this is kind of what I focused on when I was studying as a grad student. So again, obviously we already gone over kind of the makeup of pre-Columbian New Mexico, where you have kind of this combination of the pueblos who, again, remind you that are not united in any way, shape, or form, with the exception of their style of architecture. They have different languages. There's at least 16 different languages among the Pueblo people, that umbrella term that we talked about. There's different religions, cultures, et cetera, et cetera. Now, aside from the one again, aside from the fact that they have the same style of architecture, they also practice agriculture. We believe that the knowledge of agriculture, specifically when it comes to corn, beans, and tomatoes, migrated up from Mexico. And you essentially have them over the last about at least 600 years using agriculture. But please keep in mind that the agriculture that the Pueblos practiced was not based on any type of irrigation. They seem to have based their dependency on water on rainwater specifically. All right, so we don't see them taking really advantage of the river, building canals, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very, very fragile ecosystem, needless to say. And again, we already talked about the Apaches and the Dene, the various semi-nomadic, nomadic peoples that kind of wander on the periphery. And as we discussed before, we have evidence of the Pueblos engaging in conflict with not just the Apache and the Dene, but even between themselves. There were periods of peace and war, et cetera, et cetera. So, it wasn't necessarily a peaceful coexistence. Now, in um, in 1598, actually in 1596, Juan Oñate, who was the son of one of the original founders or discoverers of the silver lode in Zacatecas, gets permission from the viceroy to lead an expedition into what is now New Mexico, to colonize it, to settle it, and to convert the natives to Christianity. Now, Oñate was hoping to kind of follow in his father's footsteps and find some form of treasure, some form of silver or gold. By this point in time, by 1598, it had been very clear that there were no more, Aztec empires or Incan empires. There was not going to be another, massive empire of gold and silver and treasure. But there still was a possibility that they would indeed find, much like in Zacatecas, a a large load of silver or gold hidden in the mountains. And so Juan de Oñate had kind of hoped to be the next, person to find such a lode. Well, the word lode refers to the actual, the silver and gold in a mine or a particular vein in any type of mountain range. But nonetheless, Juan de Oñate and a few hundred settlers marched north from what is now southern Chihuahua, and eventually crossed over into what is now what at the time was called Paseo del Norte, which is now called obviously El Paso. They had a small feast of thanks and continued on the journey until they reached what is now northern New Mexico. Upon reaching it, they pretty much kind of collected all the local regional chiefs, representatives of the local pueblos, and pretty much asked or forced them to submit to the will of the King of Spain, and established a colony of New Mexico. Now, for the first few years of the colony, the Spanish settlers had mostly become dependent on the local pueblos for food. They would require that the local pueblos pay tribute in the form of food. But as I mentioned earlier, the fragile ecosystem of the region made the collection of food incredibly difficult, or at least long term, I should say. Now, eventually, this kind of or a constant requirement of food eventually came to a head. There is a pueblo about an hour west of what is now Albuquerque called Acoma, which sits on a plateau, kind of almost like a fortress in many ways. The Spanish had a couple of Spanish soldiers, about 2 dozen, arrived and basically demanded that that the locals trade for food. Now, in this case, they're trading kind of like axes or other small tools in exchange for food, which the Ackermans really could not afford to let go. And so a plan was quickly devised, and the Spanish soldiers were ambushed by the Pueblos. About 10 of the Spanish soldiers in the original party were killed, and the rest were able to escape back to the capital, Santa Fe. Upon learning about what happened, the governor Oñate sends a relatively large force into Acoma and lays siege to the city. And eventually, the city is kind of attacked by cannons and gunfire. And after a small battle, hundreds of Acoma natives were killed. The survivors, the surviving adults were pressed into slavery. The children were given to the missionaries to again to convert and to live with them. And specifically, the surviving men, which there wasn't that many of them, about 13 of them, were ordered not only to be enslaved, but also to have their right foot severed. Now, this is still very much a controversial issue in New Mexico because, again, Juan de Oñate, in the minds of many northern New Mexicans, as they call themselves Hispanos, is considered to be kind of like the founding father of New Mexico. So there's a kind of a legend, an endearing legend built around them, despite the fact that, not only the situation in Nakama is a stain on his legacy, but also he at the end of the day he wasn't that good of a governor. He spent most of his time as governor not even in New Mexico, kind of wandering in what is now Arizona and Colorado, looking for these potential silver mines or gold mines. And so he oftentimes neglected his duties to the point where the local missionaries actually, filed lodged a formal complaint to the viceroy, and the viceroy recalled him back to Mexico. He was eventually indicted on a couple of charges in terms of dereliction of duty, violence, unnecessary violence against the natives, and eventually stripped of his titles. Now, eventually, he will, basically go to the king himself in Spain and receive a pardon, but his reputation never fully recovered. Um, Even after the Oñate, governorship, you do have a very contentious rivalry between the two forms of government. Now, remember, keep in mind that in most parts of New Spain, you basically have two distinct branches of government. The secular, which is, of course, the governor, the local civil officials, mayors, whatever, and then you also have the ecclesiastical government, which is basically the church. And oftentimes, their priorities do not oftentimes match each other. And there are instances, especially in New Mexico, where local governors who don't succumb to the will or don't meet the I guess the demands of the church, oftentimes will find themselves arrested and facing an inquisition, right, for violating these rules. And so you have this rivalry forming now. The ecclesiastical government itself prioritized the conversion of the natives to Catholicism, and oftentimes this included using force in the form of torture, in the form of physical violence, in the form of, just really, again, using any means necessary to try to force the natives into adopting Catholicism. Now, this forced conversions combined with the constant demands for food and labor by the Spanish settlers essentially began causing a lot of resentment, needless to say, among the native population. And eventually, you have the pueblos kind of conspiring with each other to try to resolve these issues, or try to figure out a way to force the Spanish out of New Mexico. Now, keep in mind that prior to Spanish colonization, the natives have never really united with each other. I mean, the pueblos, some of them are friendly, some of them were not, but at the end of the day, there was never this coordination between one and the other. Um, and so all of a sudden now the pueblos are kind of putting their differences aside and actually conspiring to revolt against Spanish rule. And this actually happens in August of 1680 when most of the pueblos simultaneously revolted against the Spanish. Now, this revolt was a very simple process. The Pueblos planned to basically kill as many Spaniards as they could find, all right, before the Spanish could react, and they were mostly successful. About 300 Spanish settlers were killed, including as many priests as they could find. Now, the fact that the rebelling pueblos emphasized and focused on the missions and the missionaries. That seemed to be their main focus of anger, where missionaries that they captured were not only killed, but they were tortured to death in many instances. Right, basically either being beaten to death, or burned alive, or skinned alive. And as horrible as that is, again, this kind of shows the resentment of the natives against the missionaries, who they felt more than anything else more than anyone else had exploited them over the last 80 or so odd years. And so the Spanish, those who survived the initial attacks, were forced to basically abandon New Mexico and flee south into what is now here in El Paso, specifically down in the area of Fayben, San Elizario, and Isleta. Um, and so for about 12 years, the Spanish were eliminated from New Mexico. And during this time, during this time, the Spanish had pretty much just were debated amongst themselves, should we engage in, and try to reconquer this area? Should we even bother with New Mexico? What's the point? But there were, starting around 1688, there started to be reports that both French and English, parties of explorers were starting to kind of wander around this frontier region of what we now call the American Southwest. And so this really disturbed both the Viceroy and the King of Spain. So the King of Spain ordered the Viceroy to reconquer New Mexico for the purpose of establishing I guess what you would call a buffer area. And I'll show you here on this map here, this buffer area to protect Mexico, the core kind of colony of the Spanish here in the New World, to protect it from any type of possible Spanish or English, or even in a few years Russian interference. Now, and so in 1692, I'm sorry, not Juan Leonate, Diego de Vargas is named governor of New Mexico and is ordered to reconquer New Mexico, given a few hundred men, more settlers, and marches north from Paseo del Norte. When he gets there, the governor, Diego de Vargas, immediately begins realizing that the pueblos have, over the last 12 years, have become disunited. Many of them begin robberies amongst each other. There are wars. The Apaches and the Dene have kind of taken advantage of the situation and are attacking the pueblos. And so some, not all, but some of the pueblos actually welcome the Spanish, as a return to normalcy. In their mind, they would rather go through the process of being subjugated by the Spanish, but at least there be stability, at least there be a sense of order. In New Mexico, over the last 12 years, has been really nothing but chaos, and so the um, the Spanish are very clearly, I'm sorry, the Pueblos really much would prefer this over the alternative. And so beginning in 1692, and starting for the next 5 years, the Spanish reestablished themselves in New Mexico during this period of what we call Reconquista. There is an attempt there is another revolt in 1696 that attempts to throw the Spanish out, but that quickly falls apart, and you have the Spanish remaining in New Mexico until Mexico's independence in 1820. Now, the next slide, I just want to briefly cover the other European powers aside from the English. We'll talk about next week. Now, the Spanish, I mean, I'm sorry, the Spanish found themselves again, competing with other European powers, not just in North America, but in other parts of the eventual, kind of European imperialist sphere. And the French, next to the Spanish, create the largest land empire, despite the fact it looks very, very different from what the Spanish are doing. Now, the French, a few years after Columbus's expedition, begin the process of actually exploring the Americas, really, at the end of the day, for the purpose of looking for this so-called Northwest Passage. Now, let me just revert to this map back here in the previous slide. So, of course, it's not letting me, but so in the Americas, needless to say, the desire for Chinese goods, despite the fact that you have already discovered the Americas and this continent, that the desire to for these Chinese products, again, as we talked about, silk, paper, spices, all these products are found exclusively in East Asia, never really goes away. And so with this in mind, the Europeans, while they begin colonizing, still hope to find an access route to the east, to East Asia. And right now, the only way to do that is to essentially kind of go down underneath South America and come back up through the Pacific, which takes forever. And so there's this long rumored passage, this long rumored waterway that somehow connects the Atlantic with the Pacific. And this rumored legendary passage, which again technically doesn't really exist, is known as the Northwest Passage. And again, the purpose of this, or at least that is, at least for the French early on, the number one priority for this, for the French and even the English and the Dutch, was to find this Northwest Passage, this shortcut to East Asia. Now, um, despite early attempts to try to find this passage, it never really comes to fruition. And so, nonetheless, the French decide to make the best of the situation and to begin the process of actually colonizing or creating their own colonies in the New World for the purpose of financial gain. Now, in 1608, Samuel de Champlain leads an expedition of colonists here to the New World and establishes actually two colonies: Quebec, which you can see here in Canada, or what is now Quebec itself, the province of Quebec in Canada, and Acadia, which is now Newfoundland, here in this region here. Actually, it's called Prince Edward Island. Newfoundland is down here. It's Prince Edward Island here. Now, these two colonies themselves combined form what will become New France. Now, much like in Spain, the French are somewhat very hands-on when it comes to colonial administration. Remember, when we're talking about the Spanish back from Spain still manage, the ins and outs in the daily lives of many of the colonists, and the French kind of are in the same boat, where the French government in Paris is still very much active in how the colonial administration runs. Now, I do want to focus here on the process of fur trapping. So remember, keep in mind that North America does not have the level of does not have the gold and silver mines that Mexico or Peru has. It doesn't have the kind of the wealth, the physical wealth that the areas of new of north of Central and South America have. And so the French, and as we'll see later on, the English and the Dutch all have to find another type of resource of income. And so all of a sudden, just by coincidence, the use of fur hats, fur clothing, et cetera, becomes incredibly desirable in the um, in Europe. It becomes fashionable. And so, with the European furs, European animals that provide fur become basically extinct, the European beaver, which was actually one of the, had a large population up until this point, literally is hunted into extinction. And so, all of a sudden, now North America provides a huge, a seemingly unlimited source of furs for European consumption. And so fur trading becomes the kind of the main source of income for New France. Now, um, most of the French settlers who arrived here came in the form of, I guess, what you would call indentured servitude. And we'll talk about what indentured servitude means next week, more specifically when we talk about the English settlement. But it basically means someone who arrives here on a debt. They couldn't afford the trip on their own, so they basically have to indebt themselves in order to pay for this trip. And they have to pay it in the form of work, labor. In this case, the French oftentimes come in the form of engage, which essentially means workers. So many of the fur trappers essentially are working here to pay off their debt. Now, needless to say, when it comes to looking for furs, you see the French oftentimes going into the unknown parts of North America looking for sources of furs, beavers, elk, deer, etc., etc. And so much of North America is actually mapped by these French trappers, these runners of the forest, these coureurs de bois. All right, these runners of the forest really are kind of the early frontiersmen of French North America. So the other thing I want to emphasize when it comes to the French in North America is the relationship with the Native Americans. Now, there is attempts to convert the Native Americans in North America to Catholicism. All right, it's nowhere near as emphasized as it is in Spain, but nonetheless, the King of France finances many expeditions by the Jesuits, the missionaries, to come into North America for the purpose of conversion. Now, for the most part, most of these conversions are unsuccessful. The Native Americans of North America are much more resistant to any type of religious interference than, say, for example, in Mexico or in South America. In many instances, you have many of these Jesuit missionaries being brutally murdered by the local Native American populations because of this, attempt to forcibly convert them. Nonetheless, despite this lack of interest or this violent reaction to Catholicism, you do have the French realizing the benefits of alliances with the local with many of the tribes of this particular region, and so the French maintained relatively friendly relationships with many of the tribes, political entities that are found in North America at this point in time. All right, not only is it mutually beneficial to not only is it beneficial to the French to maintain good relationships for the purpose of looking for furs. The French realized what better way to accumulate furs than to ask the local native populations who know the lay of the land more than anything else. All right, not only that, but the French begin offering to trade furs for firearms. And so firearms become the number one trading commodity for the Native Americans. All right, and they oftentimes use that to engage in conflicts with the local indigenous. I'll give you an example here. The Huron, which are located in what is now here in northwestern New York, southern Canada, had been in a conflict with the local rival population of it's a particular type of the Mohicans for centuries. A rivalry that goes back even before Columbus. And there had always, there were sometimes they would fight, but for the most part, it was a very antagonistic relationship. And when the Hurons began trading with the French for firearms, the Huron used those new these newly acquired weapons to actually wipe out this particular tribe of the Mohicans. Um, it was a very, very, and it kind of shows you the impact of European trade, where all of a sudden now you have firearms being included, which are much more effective at eliminating these traditional rivals of French allied Native American tribes. Now, much like in Spain, the process of mestizaje. If you already remember, we were talking about mestizaje, this kind of mixture of Native American and European peoples exists in French, which we call today métis. As a matter of fact, the in history, in the field of history, whenever we're talking about I guess what you would call people of mixed race, we often refer to as we call this process of mestizaje métis. And so all of a sudden, with more and more French men either obtaining Native American wives, both forcibly and willingly, you have this population of these métis, of these mestizos. Now, here in the region of the Great Lakes, you have now the thing that I should probably mention right now is that the French colonies never really grow more than 30,000 people. Now compare that to, say, for example, the 13 colonies, which will develop around the same time. Their population at the time of independence was about 3 million people. All right, so compare that to the French colonies, which never had surpassed about, again, 30,000 actual French settlers. Um, and so, and most of the population is focused around the area of the St. Lawrence River here, or the island of Acadia here. And so, because of this, the area here that was claimed by France, this area around the Great Lakes becomes what is known as this middle ground, which, more and more scholarly work is kind of put into researching what the relationship between Native Americans and Europeans was. And for many ways, it was kind of a neutral zone. There was really no settlement, at least European settlement. Europeans came, they traded, they conducted business, and would leave. And so this middle ground kind of serves as this kind of open, neutral area in many regards, and it was established as a place to conduct business. And it is here that the Métis, those of both French and Native American ancestry, serve a very important role because they serve in many ways as what we call cultural brokers. People who can um, transcend both, who both know whatever native language is in question and French, who know French customs and native customs. And so these people become incredibly important in the process of establishing these relationships that I'm referring to here. Now, um, the the Dutch um, now, the Dutch engaged had attempted to establish a colony here again for the purpose of fur trapping and possibly maybe even an agricultural system. Now, the Dutch really don't send well, let me rephrase that. The Dutch government really doesn't have a lot to do with the colonies out in North America or elsewhere. The Dutch West India Company is a company made up of investors, like any other company is today in modern business context. And so these investors send these settlers out into various parts of the world to establish possible colonies. Now, in this case, the Dutch West India Company was given permission to begin settling this area of what we now call today New Jersey, Delaware, and the Hudson River here along New York. And so, again, the purpose of this colony was to essentially establish a colony for the purpose of profit. And at the heart of this colony was the city of New Amsterdam, which is now modern day Manhattan. Manhattan itself is the island, right? What is now today at the heart of New York City. And it is here that you have this island that is established the capital of this new I guess what you would call New Holland or New Netherlands. Remember, keep in mind that Holland and Netherlands, it's the same thing for this area that we're talking about here. Now, in terms of governance, the Dutch are a lot more, I guess what you would call a lot more progressive or a lot more innovative than the French or the Spanish. Now, first of all, there are many more women, families in general, that are brought in than the Spanish and the French do. All right, so women have much more of a say. Women, in terms of legal, the Dutch legal system can raise or can negotiate property. They can sign contracts. So women are given many more rights in the Dutch legal system than in, say, for example, the Spanish or the French. In addition, the the Dutch are much more religiously tolerant. The Spanish, as we have seen already, aren't really fans of religious toleration. That the French, while they're not as zealous as the Spanish are, they still nonetheless don't really care for particularly Protestants. And we'll talk about the whole concept of Catholics and Protestants in just a bit, or at least in the next couple of slides. But nonetheless, the Dutch you do begin to see this kind of hodgepodge of different religious Christian sects, Presbyterians, Calvinists, Lutherans, et cetera, et cetera. So you do have much more religious toleration than in other parts of North America. Now, the Netherlands attempted to encourage settlers by enticing not necessarily individual settlers, but wealthy merchants. So what the Dutch government would do is pretty much offer this deal to these wealthy individuals known as patroons. Patroons are kind of like the main businessmen of the Dutch. They're incredibly wealthy and they have a lot of influence. And so the Dutch government goes to the patroons and says, and tells them, if you, for every 150 settlers that you pay for to come to the New World, we will grant you these huge swaths of land. And so this is how the Dutch had tried to encourage the patroons to basically cover the expense of Dutch settlers to go to the New World. Right? And so this patroonship, as it's known, all right, begins encouraging the Dutch to migrate into the New World. It's somewhat successful. All right, you do have, at least for the first few years, you do have patroons sponsoring and paying for these trips, but nonetheless, the process of actual migration does go relatively slow. Now, much like the French, the Dutch begin realizing the benefits of having Native American allies, and so while you don't see the level of trade, or I'm sorry, of interaction, like say for example in France or even in Spain, you do nonetheless have the Dutch becoming reliant on Native Americans to guide them in terms of trying to find animals to hunt for the use of their fur. So again, remember, keep in mind that in all instances, whether it's the Spanish, the French, or the Dutch, you have kind of, especially in these frontier regions, in the areas where you have this blurred line between Native American and European territory. You essentially have kind of this culture developing, this borderland region developing, and think of it much like here in the area of El Paso, where you have this blending of both American and Mexican cultures, where you have this kind of tradition forming, where you have the blending of two distinct cultures, but yet they mix together in terms of language, in terms of customs, in terms of many aspects of society. And so these borderlands of these regions, whether we're talking about here in the middle grounds, or we're talking about here in northern New York, or even in New Mexico, which is kind of the frontier region of New Spain, you have these kind of blending of peoples and ideas, and it's one and it's a fascinating topic within the field of history itself. So this concludes chapter one, and again, it's a lot longer than I thought it would be, and I apologize, but we'll start with chapter two and try to finish as much as possible next week. And I'll also get you ready for your exam, kind of give you a parameters and what to expect, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll post the study guide for the exam sometime this weekend. Just please keep an eye on it. On it. In the meantime, again, thank you so much for your attention. Like I said, I would much rather have done this in person, but it is what it is. So we'll see you all next week. Again, reminder, please make sure you have these assignments due coming up on Saturday. But other than that, if you have any other questions, concerns, anything else like that, please let me know. Thank you all so much.